How's it going, everyone? So I had a question from user Rachel McAdams Lover, and this person was asking about how I perceive different types of intelligences and what makes somebody smart, and how smarter people think, and what makes people that have less intelligence not able to succeed as much. And so I'm just quoting off of what she wrote, but I'm going to put those things together and kind of synthesize what I perceive to be intelligence, and then kind of tie that into different types of success. Intelligence does not necessarily uh, mean that you're going to be successful, um, nor does a lack of intelligence mean that you're not going to be successful. That has been shown many, many different times again. And success is, of course, its own definitional point. Depends on what you call success. If we're just talking material wealth, then that's pretty obvious. Plenty of not so smart people are quite big, especially in mass media. Um, Tons of super smart geniuses don't make terribly much. They're working in lower level engineering or not-for-profit stuff, and they're using their genius, but in a more possibly self-sacrificial way, or they're just not entrepreneurial enough to really make it big, big. So going over how I define intelligence, I wrote out a metric that goes as follows. Someone who is intelligent has long-term orientation. They have symbolic reasoning, and I define symbolic reasoning as given a set of definitions and symbols, much like in math. Your ability to use and manipulate those symbols. I use then logical reasoning as a third measure. Logical reasoning is pretty typical, like logic theory, P's and Q's, if-then statements, but which is close to symbolic reasoning. It's basically symbolic reasoning, but as applied to language. So logical reasoning is your ability to think about statements and how they interact on a linguistics level. And that's different from, saying, 5x plus 2 equals 10. Symbolic reasoning versus the lingual understanding and how to relate ideas are two different things. They're closely associated, and I would tie those both into a larger category of critical reasoning. But I have to break those apart because they can be distinctly applied. The fourth factor is creative drive. That's a natural ability to come up with new ways of thinking, new ideas. And memorization is the final one. The ability to digest information, store it, and bring it back. And all of these together, if perfected, would make for someone who is wildly amazing. As some might say, a Renaissance man or woman. A Leonardo da Vinci, someone who has long-term orientation, someone who can decipher a set of symbols as given with definitions. Someone can take language and take abstract concepts and compare them. Someone who can come up with new ideas. Someone who could take lots of information and store it and bring it back out for later. And depending on the type of intelligence someone has, their level of intelligence might vary. And some put a lot of weight on the critical reasoning, which I say is the symbolic and logical reasoning. And you say that's mostly associated with those who are more math savvy, people who are just really good at patterns, shapes, and taking structures and analyzing and comparing structures as exist. People who can do this don't necessarily have to be creative, and in fact, many people who are very smart lawyers that I've seen and have worked with, they're not creative, but they can deduce preset information. They can't come up with anything new, but they can wildly make deductions and/or inferences from a given set of facts and assumptions. The long-term orientation is something that you really have to have for success in building structures. Long-term orientation is the ability to have a sense of oneself in time and to think about the future and calculate possibilities and what one wants goal-wise. A person can have a very high sense of immediate IQ. They can have very good critical reasoning. You can put in front of them a bunch of questions, and if they're short enough, someone might be able to go through them really quick and do really great math calculations, or maybe do some sort of like problem solving with shapes. However, those same people might have long-term orientation. It's a distinct thing. You can be good at doing something immediate, but you might get bored easily, and that can tie into your creative drive as well. But you might be someone who loses attention, or once it gets past the immediate, you can't think too much in the abstract. Long-term orientation is definitely needed for people who are academic smart because it requires diligence in completing assignments, diligence in preparing for tests over the long term, over the long haul. You know, there's lots of people who, and this would be an example, lots of people who maybe don't have great GPAs because they don't care. You know what I mean? Maybe they're bored or they're like, yeah, whatever. You know, they're smart people, but they have great, you know, symbolic and logical reasoning, but they don't have the push for themselves, the self-discipline, the long-term orientation to apply it. The people who do are the people who get the good grades and they get the good standardized test scores. The people who don't have the long-term orientation are not self-disciplined. Are the kinds of people who might be just great test takers and they'll just, you know, do well on the major tests, but they don't have the motivation to do the small stuff in between, thinking about the long-term big picture goal. Creative drive, that is ingenuity. It's coming up with new ways of doing things. And creative drive can come into any of the other fields. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be, oh, I'm a great painter, or, you know, I come up with amazing ideas in terms of like architecture. You know, you can you can be creative in terms of maybe new theories or functions that are within the logical symbolic reasoning. You can come up with great theories creatively in, you know, long-term orientation, or great theories in memorization. But the point is that creative people can take a lot of information that's given to them or take their environments and they come up with stuff new. They mix, they match. And in some cases, it will always appear like, in some cases to them, it might always appear that something's just sprouting organically, that their mind's just forming new thoughts. Now, of course, the mind is observing everything, and it is very much contingent in development upon what is observed. Um, Not getting too philosophical here, but some people might, you know, talk about the can you imagine a color outside of the light spectrum. Uh, Very hard to be sure that you're imagining something that's outside of what can be experienced through the eyes in terms of color. You know what I mean? That it's, you know, it's one of those interesting philosophical questions. That's not necessarily what we're talking about here. We're just talking about the ability to come up with new, with at least what's around you, in front of you, what you've been exposed to, new ways to interact and adapt. And people that are really good with symbolic reasoning to a high extent could also be very good in the creative drive, especially when it comes to geometry and those types of things. Finally, memorization. Rote memorization is just, can you memorize facts? Can you memorize information? You know, can you know, memorize a couple lines and recite it back? Can you remember a bunch of facts and list them out? Can you know, interact with some different types of discrete pieces of information that you're exposed to and save it for a long time. And of course, there's short term, there's long term, there's different types of memory, but generally speaking, the ability to capture information and, if it's desired, hold it for the long term. Is that a possibility? The higher that is, the higher someone's intelligence might be for repeating things. And it's great, especially if you know how to apply that in the logical reasoning realm. If you have lots of information, wow, then you have a great base from which to go on logical reasoning, because you have different points and bases from which to analyze and compare. So how does one increase these attributes in terms of intelligence? And I would recommend, if somebody wants to do more research, to check out Tony Buzan's work, Using Both Sides of Your Brain. He is I guess you could say, a mind games, memory enhancing type of person. Someone that, you know, works with helping people raise their IQ. I think that his philosophies and theories were things that I read about after my own experiences in school, growing up, and I found corroboration with what he did and what I did. But I didn't apply it knowingly. I didn't apply his theories knowingly. I didn't say like, oh, this is what I'm going to do to remember stuff. I just did it because it was part of my nature in terms of personality. I'm an ENTP. You know, creative but logical, sociable. It's an interesting dynamic because it's having both of the high end social elements, the chill elements, but also the high elements of critical philosophical thinkers. So I have that weird balance between, oh, socialite kind of person, and person who is like a critical thinker, big philosophy person, you know, big picture person, you know, grand theories, whatever, and logical reasoning. And for me, what I always did with memorization is I use, you know, anagrams, acronyms, jokes, crude humor, even in you know what I was at the time. I was in a private Christian school, but I still used things that would not have been approved in order to remember things, and I knew how to branch things, and my mind naturally um, is great at um, certain types of social IQ, remembering things that are said to me and piecing them together in abstract ways. My logical reasoning is very high. My creative drive is very high. Symbolic reasoning is not as high as people that have super high IQs, like the kind of people that are going to go into Mensa. I'm still good with it, and I'm very trainable in it. But I don't consider myself to be like, oh yeah, that's that 160 IQ guy who's gonna sit there and do the Mensa test and be like, oh yeah, like this guy's just super genius. I'm not like some, Einstein or Samuel Kahn or something. Um, Long-term orientation has also been high of mine, which has helped, of course, academically. So what happens is if you're, for example, if someone like me, you're like, crap, I want to really bring up my symbolic reasoning. For me, that came with a lot of patience because my social side of myself, has a little bit of impatience in learning. So what that means is I have to spend more time really getting focused with my brain. And, some of the tricks that you might say is like, focusing the 8 and stuff like that before studying. That is watching an 8-line draw to help your brain focus on the immediate moment and working through symbolic reasoning. And I never had a problem in my studies and stuff like that. I was basically a straight A student, did college calculus before I graduated high school, and those kinds of things. But um, those things could always be honed and made better, and that requires practice and understanding oneself. And for me, a lot of people will say, "Oh, this is kind of bunk," but for me, in my more savant sense, I'm more of a social type of savant in terms of reading, understanding personality, and abstract pictures with logical reasoning and creative drive. I find the MBTI to actually be extremely accurate for understanding human personality and how to work on one's weaknesses. And very quickly, if you go through that and take the test and get an accurate result, you can kind of look and see as to what is hard for you. So, for example, this is more to those who already know about it. If you were an ISTJ, you're introverted, you're sensing, you're thinking, you're judging. What does that mean? You're introverted, more likely to be alone or only if you want a couple of friends. You're sensing, you go with what you know, you don't go with new things. So you're not as philosophical. T, you're rational and logic. You're a very rational thinker on the average. J, you tend to like to know what the plan is. You're judging. You don't like necessarily to explore new things right off the bat. You kind of like to go in an orderly way. You don't like to be surprised. Putting those things together, an ISTJ, in order to enhance their mind, has to do experiments with creative thinking because their natural sense is to be very logical, rational, and orderly. They'll be great at doing schoolwork and as long as the information is communicated correctly, digesting it and putting it back out there. But they won't be as good at coming up with new ideas. And that's very true for a lot of attorneys. A lot of attorneys are in that realm. ISTJ, INFJ, INTJ. INTJ is a little bit more on the creative edge. That's a good balance. A lot of professors are INTJs. And the reason is because they're naturally orderly. They do come up with new ideas, but their weakness is that they get stuck in their ways. They're not as challenging as much as like an ENTP or ENFP is in terms of always challenging themselves creatively. So with that in mind, look at yourself, look at your strengths and your weaknesses, and then think about ways to work on what is hard for you. If you're a P type, right, and especially if you're an NP type, if you're an ENP type or anything like that, you're gonna have trouble with your long-term orientation typically, and you're gonna have trouble with focusing in order to really get together your logical and symbolic reasoning. Just naturally because you're a more social person, because you're like less committal, you're less you're less likely to want to digest and take the time to work through long problems. You know what I mean? You'd rather for a person like that, you'd rather sit there with a group of friends and talk about math concepts than to sit there and be alone and be like, oh, I have to work through this by myself. You know what I mean? So it's those kinds of things where it's like if you want to grow a certain part of your intelligence, you have to look at your personality and work on that aspect of your intelligence in the mode of your mind. And sometimes it requires going outside your comfort zone and recognizing that and seeing how you can practice. And so, for some people that is practicing creativity. For other people, it's practicing focus and long-term orientation. So I hope that helps explain how I approach intelligence, how I approach personality and growing intelligence, and I didn't really get as much to the success part, but because the short of it is that success is what you want to make it to be. I mean, if I want to sum it up really quick, If money is the end goal, guess what? There's tons of beautiful people who are not very smart and they are successful because they use their beauty to make money. There are tons of people who use their creativity to make money even though they're not great at symbolic or logical reasoning. You know, you can be successful in any area of life and you can apply those skills. It's just the entrepreneurial side of yourself. How are you selling those skills? How are you making yourself unique? How are you making yourself valuable to other people? So success in that way is relative. It really is. But if you want to grow your hard intelligence, which again, that's not going to prove your success. It might help you with school. It might help you with doing math homework. It might help you with doing things that require logical thinking. It might, especially if you do logical reasoning, it might help you make wiser decisions in how you analyze information that comes to you, how you decide what is credible or what is not credible in terms of relying on new pieces of information. But will that make you successful? No. You can know lots of great information and still just be dirt poor or unknown or whatever your definition of success is. So take it with a grain of salt, but you can do it. If you want to do it, it's up to you. It's in your hands. All right, talk to y'all later, and I'm out.